worse than silence in a room, the Zoom silence. Okay, so firstly, it's a small, intimate group of people, so it would be really nice if Felipe could see all of you and generally have it in gallery view. So if you're willing and able, please do keep your video on. I have had a phenomenon and a feeling also of having literally, like, I've been getting putchy eyes or feeling like the face, like Zoom is actually pulling my face in, and it's a physical feeling that of tiredness, and I do get that. But it's not really a webinar as much as it is intimate conversation between people trying to figure out, or we're all here because we want to understand something about what the pedagogy of the future is going to look like, what the role of theater might be. And I know that these are questions that everyone has been asking, and there are lots of conversations that have been being had about them. But the aim of Unrehearsed Futures is twofold. One is a selfish aim, is that we are trying to design a course for the drama school and we want to do it very in a very considered manner. And so I started having conversations on my own with different people, and then I realized that these are conversations that we really should be having with all the different people who collectively make the drama school and make our pedagogy work. So I did this for the benefit in the original instance for people who teach and learn at the DSM. But having said that, there's also this secondary sort of idea, which is whilst everyone is putting work out there and everyone is doing a whole bunch of things and taking action and trying to figure it out, everyone has launched Zoom classes, everyone has launched different ways of teaching and flipping the learning, and all of that is happening in practice. But there's also been a sense of isolation in terms of, I'm doing this, I'm figuring it out, but who else is figuring it out? And what are they thinking? And so this is an opportunity for all the different people who come, and that's why I'm hoping that if we can have a recurrent audience here, that we actually start to form our own little tribe of people who sort of became acquainted on Unrehearsed Futures. And which comes to the third bit, which is Unrehearsed Futures is what we're calling it. It's not owned by the Drama School Mumbai. In fact, from next week, we're probably going to take the logo off it completely. We just want to have the Unrehearsed Futures conversations, and any two people should be able to have the Unrehearsed Futures conversation and invite other people to it. Because I know that there are people out in New York who are fast asleep right now who also want to be a part of this conversation. And it's an important conversation. I met Felipe. I had the real pleasure of meeting him during this World Training Theatre Institute. It's a UNESCO body, ITI, Intercultural Theatre Institute. No. Okay, UNESCO has a body for theatre called the ITI, and ITI has a training division called WTVV, I can't remember exactly. And they held a conference which is basically Eastern European and Russian, and Felipe presented at that conference. And much of that conference was a little tough to sort of digest, and felt like the old world not coming to terms with the new. I am being a little critical. But Felipe was a refreshing breath of fresh air in terms of somebody who was really looking at it now, seemed to have been doing work in this sort of hybrid digital stroke real world for a while. And he had some really nice examples of that. And all of that just made me want to reach out to him. And he was really great. I mean, literally picked up the email, responded within 2 days. We got on a Zoom call. And we've talked about a bunch of stuff before Unrehearsed Futures even came up as an idea. But I think that conversation with him was where the idea was born, where I just said, Felipe, come and talk to my faculty. And then by that time, I was talking to 2 or 3 or 4 global people across, planetary people across the planet. You'll understand why I just made that correction. And that's why, then I realized that these are, enough people are thinking about the same thing, that we should be talking together. But the conference format, the panel discussion format, the hierarchies just didn't seem to work for me. And I think in keeping with what this space seems to be doing to all of us, I mean, it's really democratizing things in some ways and not in others. So let's just have conversations. So the way the format of this works is listen in. Felipe will open with some opening remarks that came out of the big, broad questions. How do you teach in the absence of presence? What is the role of a drama school right now, especially a drama school that's supposed to teach the medium of theater? There are other what happens to somatic learning. What has digital given us that is necessary? What has digital given us that we don't want and we want to go back? Like John was saying earlier, I cannot wait to go to a valley in the middle of a Greek island and far away from the sea and get back to a de-zoomed world. And all of these are legitimate responses to something that we're all experiencing. I mean, there hasn't been a universal experience like this for a while, not in my lifetime. So that's the genesis of all of this. The format is going to be that Felipe will make some opening remarks. I will listen and ask a few opening questions, but I really want to get out of the space of being that moderator sooner than later. And so if you guys have questions, start by putting them up on the chat window, which Shruti Arora, who's our course advisor, is kindly moderating. And beyond that, just take the conversation out where it's questions to the group, it's questions to Felipe. It could be building on something that got discussed earlier, and we'll pick up threads in a kind of conscious and deliberate way. And me as moderator will just say, look, let's stay with this thread for a little bit. Oh, okay, we haven't answered that question. We forgot, and I'll just see. I'll try and just balance the conversation. That's all I'll try and do. Whole space. That's all. Okay. Felipe. Without further ado, you are co-host so that you can manage the Zoom platform the way you want to. And we're very happy to listen in and begin. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much to you, Jehan, for inviting me, for being open to having conversation, to being generous. I have a past as an actor many years ago. And the first time that I transitioned from being an actor and becoming of an academic, the first professional academic talk that I gave was in India. So it's always very good to be back in India. Hi to everybody. As Jehan mentioned, my name is Felipe Cervera. I am originally Mexican, but I have been in Singapore for close to 9 years. I did my PhD here. I remain here. I work here. I teach at LaSalle College of the Arts. Those of you who don't know LaSalle, which is probably everybody, we are the University of the Arts here in Singapore. We're a small art school, arts college, with approximately 5,000 students dispersed in various faculties and various programs. I teach at the School of Dance and Theater. And as I was explaining earlier to Jehan and Daniel, my role in the School of Dance and Theater is to be the theory guy. I'm the person in charge of all the contextual modules and the person in charge of undergraduate research. And I approach my role as being, as making sure that the actors that we graduate are intellectually refined, that they can think beyond the evident, that they can formulate complex discursive thinking around the practice without sacrificing the very specific skills that they need to have as actors. At LaSalle, I also chair the committee in charge of revamping our online environment, mostly in reaction to COVID, but also thinking ahead. And so the talk in which Jehan and I met was partly because I was sent by my institution to explain more or less how was our thinking. And I've been doing quite a few of these talks lately. I mean, by now we have all probably sat through innumerable Zoom talks and seminars. And I don't know about you, but I'm already experiencing a bit of fatigue of all the constant cascade and bombarding of having to sit in a Zoom and receive content. And so a bit as a reaction to that, what I've come to realize is that precisely people in the UK are probably a bit off. You're probably in between semesters, but not so much. But here in Singapore, like in the US, a bit in other parts of the world, we are in the inter-semester period. And I think that this is a crucial period to start thinking of the moment, to stop thinking of the moment as a contingency, to stop thinking of the emergency, and to start realizing what disruption means, to start owning the disruption, to start meeting the moment, and to realize how we have used the tech in the last few months and how we can continue to misuse the tech, because what we have been doing in Zoom performances, that's not what Zoom was meant for. We have been misusing tech. And that thing is important to realize. So what I propose here, I'm going to be giving some introductory remarks that is really just provocations. But I really hope that we can have a moment of shared thinking. I think it's pivotal that at this point of the pandemic, precisely in theater and performance, we take a moment to breathe in and to realize, right, where are we? We have been all reacting to a global scale emergency, to a global scale pandemic, and we have been thinking on our feet, which, you know, as theater makers, we're very good at. We have been improvising in the moment, and the play hasn't collapsed. The show has gone on, right? But in this intermission, it's good to think, right, so it didn't collapse, but what next? And especially for theater schools. So theater schools, the way I see, we have very specific challenges. And one of the first challenges that we have is that the disciplinary definition that we abided for during the 20th century, which is somatic, live, synchronous teaching, is exactly the thing that we cannot do. So how do we deal with this disciplinary crisis? And furthermore, how do we deal with it without sacrificing our livelihoods? How do we deal with it without sacrificing theater? How do we deal with it without falling prey also of just the alarm moment of going like, you know, let's just do Zoom, let's just become broadcast media, and just forget about it, right? So I think we need to stop and think. I'll start sharing my screen, and as I mentioned, I'm just going to be pretty much giving provocations. I don't know about you, but when you present on Zoom, the screen changes, and then I like to see the people that I'm talking to. I don't know, but those of you who lecture, it's important. So I titled my intervention an unrehearsed planet for two reasons. Obviously, to make it align with the title of the series, Unrehearsed Futures, but also to highlight that one, what we're experiencing is planet size. That's the dimension. Two, that we're experiencing all of this in a space and in time. We have not lost that. We have lost the ability to be in the same room, but space remains key. And three, because it is a bit of an oxymoron to say that a planet has been unrehearsed. Of course, it has been unrehearsed. A planet exists in time, and as much as time unfolds, it has never happened before. How could we possibly rehearse? But what I mean is that we don't have any template. And I think that that's important in this specific moment of the pandemic, because if we don't have a template, it means that we are beholding a great opportunity of creativity. And I don't mean this to say in the corporate sense of like innovation, disruption, let's bring on new tech, but really take a moment to think about theater. Think about the things that we have taken for granted. Many of those are collapsed, are canceled at the moment, but they will return. How do we return? So I'll start by sharing what, just to give you a bit more context about LaSalle School of Dance and Theater. We have 5 programs. We have a BA Acting, BA Musical Theater, a diploma in dance, a diploma in performance, and a diploma in theater and production management. Those of you who are not familiar with the Singaporean system, the diploma is a 3-year program that is skills-based, is technique-based, but it is not degree level. And the goal is that the student goes into this course and is able to go into the industry, but it doesn't have the, say, more high level or rigorously intellectual load of a BA honors. Our degrees are honors. We have about 200 students in the school, approximately 45 to 50 per program. We produce between 10 and 15 productions every semester. Every program produces between 2 to 3 productions every semester. We also hold very proudly that we have a strong academic backbone. Our actors don't graduate just knowing how to do all sorts of techniques. They also graduate with a very strong chance and with a very strong profile to access postgraduate study, both in theater and outside. And something that we're also very proud of is that we situate our education in the Singaporean context. We are very clearly Southeast Asian, but we also have a very, very strong interest to have a global outlook. We have a very international staff. Just in the School of Dance and Theater, I have a Brazilian colleague, myself, I'm a Mexican. We have English, Irish, North American, Canadian. There's from all around. And many of us hold double appointments. I have also an appointment in Canada. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. So there's this very interesting mix at LASALLE. We're very small, we are very student oriented, and yet one of our key missions is to teach our students that theater happens in the world and that the world is out there, right? So we're always engaging in international collaborations, and that's something that in a way helped us during the pandemic. So between January and June 2020, this is more or less how things unfolded for us. We heard that the pandemic was going to happen on January the 2nd. The first alert that China gave on January the 1st, Singapore was already on not high alert, not red alert, but we already knew that this was going to happen. And we knew that this was going to happen because Chinese New Year was coming, and it was inevitable that temporary migration from China was going to flood Southeast Asia. This gave us a head start because from January, we started to plan what would eventually and effectively become a massive disruption. We started to blend our teaching from early Feb. Blending meaning we transited, all of my classes went online. We began creating online provisions for productions. By the end of February, that we went into Code Orange in Singapore, productions could no longer be held with audience, so we went ahead just with the show, but we already started to block things in a way that was safe. By the time the second round of production, so May came, late April, early May, we were already on code red, and we went into lockdown, and we transited everything online. All productions went online one day to the next. And we're speaking of productions that were already in Tech Week. We were speaking of productions that were about to open, and that within a week, they had to happen online. All practical final assessments moved online as well. So, you know, having the foresight of being a Chinese majority country that obviously expected a massive income of temporary migration from China, 1. 2, having a very clear global outlook and seeking actively international partnerships, and 3, having the possibility of including media skills into our curriculum through my modules, through the theory modules. My students produce 1 written essay and 1 video essay every semester. Because of those 3 things, we were okay. By the time the semester came, student assessment, the student module feedback was very high. All of our modules scored between 90 and 100%. The assessment from our external examiners from Central School of Speech and Drama was very positive. And the assessment from our academic links from Goldsmiths University Goldsmiths College for University of London was also very positive. And our thinking, when we realized that we had not done that bad, that actually we were very good at the initial reactions to the disruption, we also stood still and started to think. And the one thing that we realized is that we were successful because everybody was in a mindset of let's just keep the show going, including students, including parents. We're a private institution, which means that we charge fees. And so in that mindset, my cat just crossed over. In that mindset, the big learning experience of last semester was the massive disruption. It was just like react, go with the moment, right? But then that doesn't guarantee our subsistence as a private institution the next academic year. That doesn't guarantee that students will begin to drop in recruitment, precisely because if we can't teach theater the way we used to teach theater, why even bother paying for a fee? Why even enrolling now, right? And that's a big problem. That's a big problem. Personally, I was sent by my institution to at least 10 conferences on edutech, conferences, seminars, talks. And the scenario out there for higher education is terrifying. It's really, really terrifying. The expectation is that between 20 to 30,000 universities will close in the next year. And we're speaking of big universities. We're not speaking of small theater conservatoires. We're speaking of universities that have a scientific research outlook. So, right, the question is, hold on. We did well, but that doesn't guarantee that what we're doing now will work next year, right? So reflection is in hindsight that I've been decanting and brewing as an institution. We think through this, and also as it turns out, I'm at the forefront of this thinking at my institution. One of the things here for me is to stop thinking of how we apply technology to performance, right? Performance is technology. Performance is a technology of social construction. Performance is a technology of social evolution. So the point is not how do we begin to hybridize, right? Is what can we do with the kind of performance that we can do? In the reaction to the pandemic, suddenly we forgot of the public space, right? Everything became about immediacy and liveness. Hold on, we're street theater. What happened to the public space? What happened to the intervention of theater when, empty streets? How are we going to react to the empty streets, right? We became so focused on liveness and immediacy of somatic and embodied learning that we forgot the other dimensions of theater, right? And this has to do precisely because we immediately became concerned with our livelihood, but maybe there's more to it. Second reflection is that the media skills in actor, this is a trend that was already figuring in all major and minor and upcoming drama schools across the world, that an actor today needs media skills. But in a way, to speak of media skills in actor training has also become a sort of name holder, right? Yeah, sure, we need media skills, sure, yeah. Oh, my actors get media skills, yeah, but what exactly is media skills, right? What exactly are the skills? Are we teaching editing? Are we teaching filmmaking? Are we teaching video recording? Are we teaching sound recording? Are we teaching video art, right? And I think that it's important to begin thinking of this specificity at the time that we reconsider the curriculum of theater and theater training, because sure, media skills, but what media skills, right? And I'll come back to that in a bit when I prop up the question. Something also that we've been thinking is around the idea of autodidactism. Something that we realize at LaSalle is that in people that work in distance and remote learning, this is an obvious point, right? For theater people, it became evident in the last 2 months. But usually in theater education, in a performance pedagogy, the time of the teacher is equivalent to the time of the student. That means that the time of teaching is equivalent to the time of learning, right? In distance learning, that's not quite the case, right? The time of the teaching is asynchronous to the time and experience of learning. And as theater educators, we have a lot of issues grasping that, right? Because how do I assess, how do I observe that my student is doing what I am doing? How do I assess that the mimetic principle of performance pedagogy remains, right? So this is something that we need to begin thinking. And a key point here is that a lot of the people that we study, Stanislavski to start with, did not go to school to study theater. They were autodidacts. They taught themselves how to do theater, right? And we study these guys. So it's not like that it's not the first time that theater realizes that teaching oneself is a way of training, right? And that's something also to important. The fourth point is distance. We have been thinking distance in terms of digital remoteness, of distance learning as I am talking to you here. But thinking about autodidactism, there's also the distance between what the teacher says to what the student does. The distance between learning and teaching. The distance between thinking and doing. So reevaluating what distance means in theater education is also something important to think about. And fifth is that, if by now we haven't realized this, then we haven't been listening. Online does not necessarily mean interacting only with screens. Online is an interface, but the experience of making theater can continue to happen offline. There, of course, it's about documentation, but it's also about how the student reports the experience of making. It's also about how the student creates and impacts the immediacy of their environment. And this is very important. So for me, these 4 questions are key questions right now. We are living in a historical moment. Something I've been having meetings with, starting to have meetings with my students to begin to introduce the word disruption. And this is a word that Jehan and I shared as key point. We have to tell our students, we have to let them see that what they're experiencing is historical, right? Is theatrical also to the core, in the sense that it's only going to happen once. The cohorts that are going through a theater school right now will go through a theater school in a circumstance that nobody else will ever go again. So it's historical. And in as much as it is historical, it is also unprecedented. It is unrehearsed. So in a way, how does theater meet history? What is performance pedagogy in historical times? How does theater training make history? Is something that involves the student. And this again, a return to autodidactism and to active learning, right? If we're still thinking that we need to train and we need to teach somatic learning through Zoom because we want to take care of the assessment, of the evaluation, then we're missing the great opportunity, or we're avoiding a great opportunity for our students to educate themselves in unprecedented times, to make themselves history, right? This is important. The more that our students understand that what they're doing is historical, the greater learning experience that they're going to have. And in the last consequences of that argument is also how we safeguard theater at the very end. And last but not least, in that sense, what is the social contract of the drama school and how is that changing? By social contract, drama schools and theater departments in universities were allowed to exist because there were arguments made. The drama school existed because theaters needed to graduate earlier, actors needed to graduate earlier to satisfy a demand in an industry that demanded more performances. And the university department, the theater university department, was created because theater scholars gave the argument that we were not a literary discipline, that we were an embodied discipline, that we were something that required its own disciplinary specificity, right? And that's a social contract. Universities measure how many graduates they graduate. What is the employment rate, right? Drama schools they exist within a social contract of the arts. Of course, it's specific to each country. Of course, specific to how law operates in every country. So what is a social contract that gets disrupted? To begin with, if we think that for example, LASALLE graduates about 50 students every year, right? What is the social contract that they're acquiring when they graduate from a theater school in a time that theater, as we have trained them to do it, doesn't exist, right? So I don't have the answer to these questions, but these are big 4 questions that I would like to offer. Now, just to share, Jehan asked me to share about what my own research is about. My research is very much about planetary thinking, and I think the planet in very theoretical and conceptual ways, but also think the planet in very literal sense. So to give you an idea, I write about planetary performance pedagogy as much as I write about performance and outer space. But in terms of pedagogy, planetary thinking is a set of theories that emerges in the humanities as a critique to the global and globalization, thinking that that globalization is a derivation of colonial practices in which one kind of knowledge goes global rather than multiple knowledges interacting. So planetary thinking, instead of thinking of locality, thinks of multipolarity, because that accounts more, is more precise to say that India has different poles of power that interact with one another than to say that India interacts with the UK as the only pole of power. That's a fallacy, right? So multipolarity, therefore shared authorship of knowledge, One of the colonial legacies that informs the thinking of the global is that knowledge is produced by a single author, right? I am the anthropologist that produces author about India. I am the theater theoretician that produces knowledge about this technique. And if you think of multipolarity, that means that there's always a conversation that produces knowing. And that's highly didactic. That's highly theatrical if you also work that point. Planetary thinking also in terms of non-human agency. A conversation that was already emerging before the pandemic and suddenly got lost is, right, what exactly is the ecological impact of the theater conservatory in the 21st century? How many of us, I don't know about you, but last year I took 20 flights. My carbon footprint last year was completely unethical. And how many of us subsist because we're able to travel conservatoire to conservatoire teaching? And, you know, and it's not about being carbon footprintist. It's not like, there's more to it, but it's important to think, right, so how is, it's not just about canceling flights, because in the larger scheme of things, the flights that we take do not compare by, by far with other, with the carbon footprint of large oil companies, by far. We're infinitesimal. But it does raise a question of how we're thinking the planet in our curriculum. Fourth is that it's performative, right? We're not only training actors to make theater, we're training actors to enact the world. So how do they understand the world? It's important. We're not just training actors to know how to engage with psychophysical and post-psychophysical training. It's not just about Suzuki. It's about what Suzuki does to the world. And also something that I'm very advocate for is we have to let go. I mean, personally, this is coming as a Mexican as well. These divisions between East and West, North and South, not only are they geographical fallacies, but they also limit how we understand technique. We also limit how we understand each other, right? So, it will be very easy for some advocate of global studies or global South studies to say that this conversation is a South-to-South conversation because it's a Mexican talking in India, right? And in doing that, then it puts us in a second hierarchy. Oh, this is the South talking to the South. We don't care about that, right? So, and similarly, when we say it's East versus West, like where exactly does the East start? Let's not forget that Asia itself is a colonial concept, right? Asia is everything that the West wasn't, Orient. How can we possibly collapse all cultures that are from the Arabic Peninsula to Korea into a singular geopolitical unit? It's mental, right? So if we think, key thing here is multipolarity. So in terms of applying to pedagogy, this translates into, let me just arrange my Zoom screen. Of course, these are big theoretical questions, but when we pin it down into concrete applications to performance pedagogy, is that, distance learning is very much based on the binary between synchronous and asynchronous. Synchronous, understanding two bodies in the same space experiencing the same thing. Asynchronous, two bodies experiencing the same thing at different times. But if you think about it, we're always synchronous with one another in as much as we are living on the same planet, right? What is asynchronous, if anything, is day and night, which means that somebody can be teaching at night and somebody can be learning at day. That's the experience of asynchronicity. And once you're there, it's not a huge leap to think that the planet is the classroom. Like even now, right? There's people from all over connected here. So it's a reevaluation of the sense or of the notion of co-presence. We're always co-present. Co-presence and presence doesn't just happen when we're in the same room. It happens when we experience the planet at the same time as living beings with other living beings. 2, collaborative methodologies, remote tutors, companions, face-to-face instructions, all of these as the blend. We're speaking a lot of blending these days as the blend. Collaborative methodologies. We have to open our classrooms to other people in other parts of the planet, right? And third is digital and mobile technologies as extensions, the planet as a learning environment. That's another key word, learning environment. And I'm gonna just give you two examples of how I have been practicing this. This is a voice lesson pre-COVID. This is, I think, April 2019, March 2019. The lecturer is, it was on Skype, so even pre-Zoom frenzy. We forgot about Skype too suddenly. The lecturer is here. She's Selecta Behrens. She teaches at Norway Theatre Academy. And she's giving the full voice lecture, not lecture, workshop to my students in Singapore. And how we did it is that I was her avatar. There were two cameras in the room, and I was moving around with one of them. And it's one of the most warm sessions of blended teaching that I've been at. And it was a voice session. Obviously, there are technical handicaps, but not because of the environment, but because of me, because I am not a voice lecturer. If I were a voice lecturer, that lesson the whole module could have run, the whole voice module could have run like that, with Electa being in Norway and a teaching assistant in the room, or another professor of voice in the room. I can show you video because video would also allow the face of my students to be shown. And Singapore has very strict laws of data protection, so I can't risk that. And the other experiment that I have been doing is asynchronous. This is a practice research class that was focused on devising. And I didn't teach that class. I was just a tutor. The two lecturers, one was in Florida, Hannah Schwadron. She was in Florida State University. And the other one was Theron Schmidt from the University of New South Wales. I met my students once a week in our usual slot to tutor them, to advise them, to check in on them. But the actual learning and teaching, the actual practice, everything was happening on Telegram. And so how it will happen is that each one of them, Theron was working with half of my group, Hannah was working with the other half. They would give weekly prompts to my students. We came to call these digital companions, to also make the distinction between a lecturer, a tutor, and a companion. Remember, and this is a very good window to remember that the etymology of pedagogy comes from the slave that walked the kids from the school to the house. So it refers to the experience of walking and reporting knowledge. It's a companion. The pedagogue is a companion, etymologically speaking. So Hannah and Theron were companions to my students. They would send prompts. My students would work for a week on their performance, and they would send documentation of their exercise via Telegram. And I want to show you these two because on the left side, we can see Theron sending, he wouldn't send just text, he would send video messages, but he was misusing the tech because the video messages last for a minute just so they can be easily uploaded into the cloud of Telegram. But what he was doing, he was planning his session to be recorded in different spots around his house. So he recorded 1 minute in the forest, 1 minute in a window, and it's a really interesting it's really interesting experience to see how, one, the actual planet breaks into the digital area, and two, how distance and remote learning is not just some bold talking head just speaking to students endlessly, right? There's also ways in which you can engage with the digital technology that do not sacrifice the experience of making performance. And on the other end, there's the documentation of my students. These 3 students, I got permission by them. And so this is how it would work. They would send their work and Theron would then give feedback to them. So with that I end. These are the 4 questions that I leave hanging. Obviously, they're not the only ones, but at least they are the latest ones in my line of thinking. And the key thing for me right now is, what is the social contract? How does the theater school, what is the reason of being of the drama school? Of course, we have a reason, right? The point is not to go into an existential crisis saying we can no longer exist, theater is dead. Theater is not dead. Theater never went away, right? Theater has always stayed. We are in a crisis. Principles of how we think theater, how we think teaching theater are under pressure, for sure, right? The question now is to sit and think, how do we pivot out? Instead of staying in this or zooming into the crisis, how do we zoom out? And with that, I end. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. I mean, there's so much food for thought in what you shared so far that it makes me not even know where to start. And I also want to immediately filter it out to the people around us to have a conversation, start the questions. I think that it's really important that I hope you guys can see why a conversation with Felipe excited me so much, because it was this idea of how do we zoom out from it and then move beyond it into the future. There's two things that come to my mind every time I think about this. One is Arundhati Roy's article that was very recent and came in, and it's like, if the pandemic is a portal, then what are we taking with us from the past into the future, and what are we, and what do we need to leave behind? And I think that's a question for every discipline, every field, and at every level of our existence as human beings. And I think that Felipe has sort of somewhere answered the question in his way, that these are the things I want to take forward and these are the things I want to leave behind. And that's been really interesting and solid. And the other is meeting the moment. And yes, we can have this conversation at a very practical level. Well, then how do we do this? Like, how do we go about it? And Felipe, I just think that maybe we can both co-moderate this, or you can still continue the conversation. And because you did ask for a shared thinking and a shared discussion. So the things that I've really coming away with for me personally is the idea that performance is a technology. I found that really useful. It just gives me another relationship with technology. And it also makes me remember almost the Cyborg Manifesto, which was written by, I can't remember her name.
Donna Haraway.
Donna Haraway. But basically this idea that, from the moment we discovered fire, we have existed as there's technology and the relationship between human beings and technology is already a cyborg one. It's a coexistence and it's a symbiosis. And then of course you extrapolate that. She wrote about it in the context of feminism. I've just taken this idea and then seeing what all of this is in terms of our humanity. The second one is, sorry, I'm just still trying to, the second one is a beautiful one, was this idea of like the notion of pedagogy itself and the slave etymology. I'm going to look at that further for sure. But I think I'm going to just start with this, and let's take it back a little bit to the practical, but then let's bring it back out. People, if you have your responses and your thoughts, and if you have questions that you want to further tweak out, we have time now. We're due for another half an hour of conversation, after which...
Just to add to the point of technology, I'm not one to use etymologies all the time, except for when they're inspiring.
This one was inspiring.
And technologies, the etymology of technology is inspiring because it's techne and logos. And techne is craft and logos is thinking, right? So technology is not just the gadget, it's how you think about making. That's so, and that, theater is thinking on our feet, right? I mean, how many of us at some point had the doubt on whether to study philosophy or theater, right? And we went to theater just because instead of sitting thinking, sitting standing, right? So I think that etymology is also inspiring to think, right? So what is it? Performance is a technique and it's also a logos, right? If anything, is the one thing that brings them together.
So I'll field one question. I mean, I'll put one question out there, but maybe we can hear a couple of thoughts or questions from the group as well. And just sort of the way to do it is to just unmute because there's just a small number of people here, and I can just call you out, call on you. But mine is really that I'm just thinking about what does the classroom of the future look like? What are the frames in which we can incorporate a lot of what you have said? You gave us one or two examples of those of the way teaching has been forward. But then how do because one of the biggest questions that I had from Aidan last time actually is how, as a tutor in the embodied work, and I know that you're saying embodied is just one aspect of it, but how do we not lose that as we go forward in all the solutions that you provide? I think that's my first question to you, Felipe.
My thinking there is that again, I think it's important to zoom out of our reactions. Yes, our reactions as theater makers and as theater pedagogues to the pandemic have been successful. Congratulations, everybody. We saved the day. Well done. Now, let's have a beer and think how exactly we saved it. And one, we saved it by forcing co-presence into Zoom. Yeah? In forcing co-presence into Zoom, we forgot about other possibilities of slower pedagogies, of smaller class groups, right? Which of course are not profitable necessarily immediately, but they're there, right? So for me to think that Zoom sacrifices the embodied learner and the embodied teacher is not really the case. It sacrifices if that's all the things that you want to do, right? But learning will always be embodied. It's about how you transit that, how you transmit that to the student, right? And also how you relate to the authority of the teacher. I think one of the ways why we keep holding to synchronicity and body to body in the mass is because we keep holding to the teacher as the bearer of knowledge, as the verifier of knowledge, right? Of course, pedagogically speaking, in a university, that's the only way in which we can assess. Somebody has to assess that the student learn what they're supposed to learn and what they pay for sure. But the knowledge that the student can access or can experience in their room asynchronously is not any less valid than the one that they are experiencing with the teacher inside the room. It's different. Now, how do we deal with that difference? How do we accommodate that difference into the curriculum, into the rhythms of teaching, into the rigor of technique? How do we incorporate the rigor of technique in a situation in which the teacher and the student are not in the same room? That's a big question. The question is not how to teach, right? The question is how do you measure the encounter? Where is the encounter, right? Teaching can happen. Now, different countries have different situations. In Singapore, we're going to be able to go into the studio with a determined number of students, right? That we have guidelines by the government of how many people are allowed per square meter, right? And that's probably going to be the case as things unfold. So that's, again, the point. Sure, we were in a situation in which we had to go online, and that's probably going to be recurrent, right? But let's not just friend and say theater is lost, right? Embodied learning will always, that doesn't go away.
Right? And let me nuance that question. I think Amy has helped because Amy also put in a question. She couldn't be here today, but and it's exactly this. As a teacher, as a facilitator in the room, when I'm in that state of, like when I'm co-present in physical time and space, I am working with a student on so many levels, which is my technology of teaching, and which is my if I understand what you're saying. But, and in those feedback mechanisms, in those loops, in the ability to put hands on and adjust or find something, right? So much is getting transferred non-verbally, non-logically, just by the doing together, by the togetherness of the doing in real physical space. And that's where we have. And Amy's question is, I'm curious about our language for current phenomena, presence, absence, and co-presence, virtual reality, media and mediation. Because when we are online, are we absent? Because I feel slightly absent whilst I'm online. I don't feel like I am there with my student completely. Is online contact virtual or is it mediated, is Amy's question.
Well, how about peer learning? Right? Again, you could upload in very practical terms. And I'm speaking and I'm thinking, I don't mean to present myself as someone that has resolved it at all, right? I think that the question that you posed, Johan, is a $64 million question that every single conservatoire in the world is asking, right? Is a holy grail. That's it. Whomever resolves it is going to be famous for the rest of the century, if it is resolvable, right? All I'm advocating is that we consider the possibility that maybe that question, it's important, but there are other questions and other ways. What about peer learning? How many people can be in the room? Do you have to be in the room, or can student teach student? Can two people come together to teach technique to one another? Isn't that how technique is born? Why are we only thinking that the teacher needs to be in the same room? I mean, Grotowski, to give just one example, sat in the rehearsal room once a week. You know, the actors did the thing, he came, and then that's at a directorial level, right? But that meant that the bodily transfer was not mediated by the authority of the gaze, was mediated by the exchange between two bodies learning from one another, right? And that's exactly the feedback loop that you're talking about. And now, my belief is that that feedback loop, the embodied feedback loop of theater training, is sacred. We have to defend it at all costs. That is what we do, and that is what we are, right? How do we defend it in other ways? And you know, and this is exactly the institutional crisis that we are in, because the holding on to the lecturer as the center of knowledge is also holding on to the institution of the university, right? Of the big structure of education and higher education. But what about peer learning? What about slow learning? What about autodidactism? What about reporting what I experience? How do I report how the technique feels in my body? How do I document that? That's also learning. That's also different areas of theater pedagogy that in the immediate reaction of resolve the semester and go in production, we forgot, right? One thing that has been cropping up in different conversations that I've been having is a book by a French philosopher named Jacques Rancière. The book title is The Ignorant Schoolmaster. It's very far away from learning how to act. There's something there to think about. The Ignorant Schoolmaster is about a teacher that taught French to a group of students without knowing French. And you know, it's provocative to think, right, so how do I teach my students what technique, whatever technique you want to call, without leaving in the room? What other encounters can I facilitate? How many people can be in the room? Are my students living nearby, right? Can my more advanced student go and meet somebody else student and play for 2 hours if they live nearby? Can they meet in the park? Can they meet, you know, online and blend that learning and teaching with some online tutorials, with encounters with you on Zoom, right? That's all I'm saying, that in the reaction, we suddenly forgot that there's other things, that because suddenly we're isolated and locked down. But hold on, let's just zoom out from Zoom for a moment, right? What other encounters can we have?
Vinity, you want to share that verbally? And it has a chance to open it up.
Yeah, no, it just got me thinking too, you know, when you mentioned that, what about a smaller group of learning? And I just felt that, you know, the normal way that we see a classroom of, you know, being together with people, and then we sort of imagine only that space as a learning space. And this has just sort of pushed me to rethink and rewire my concept of presence. You know, like you mentioned, that you don't feel as present in an online space. And how, like maybe when I'm in an online session, how do I sort of heighten my senses to try and feel more present with a team that is virtually present with me? And maybe when I shut off and I'm back in a space in isolation, when I'm just by myself, how am I using that space now as a classroom? It might not necessarily be relevant when we're always thinking that, okay, we have our peers to learn with. So it's just got me to think that, okay, that space in solitude has become so much of a bigger learning space for me to take that experience and come back when I'm in a room online.
Mm.
Something to consider in the big sizes, and this is the institutional challenge, but it's an institutional challenge that places like LaSalle a bit less, but DSM is an ideal place to experiment, right? The group sizes, we accept 15, 20, or 35 students to each level, obviously for financial reasons, because that's the number that makes the school sustainable, but also because we're working in a model of education that is a model of horizontal progress, right? We're graduating cohorts, and we have to guarantee that 15 students match a level of knowledge that affords them to move to the next level and the next level, right? That's an economic logic of the university. You graduate groups of people. You don't graduate pupils.
It's industrial revolution work.
Right?
Mm.
Now, if you think of smaller groups, you may not necessarily be sacrificing your financial sustainability. It just means that you are experimenting with different logics of the economics of the drama school, right? And more importantly, with how knowledge is seriated, right? So, you look at the curriculums of all drama schools and, it's acting 1, acting 2, acting 3, acting 4, acting 5, acting 6. And you graduate all students, right? It's very hard in the logic of the contemporary university for one student to lag behind, right? For various reasons, because if a student lags behind, it's more probably that your external examiner is going to question your own capacity to graduate, right? But if you play around with that seriation of knowledge, you can also have different rhythms of learning without sacrificing the viability of the school.
Daniel? Or Sanakia? Well, Sanakia, go. You were talking about, you wanted to bring the point back into encounter.
Yeah, I mean, I found that very interesting to talk about encounter because, I mean, two things, even after that, when you spoke about this idea of peer learning, and I think this thing, that when we look at online, we only think of the possibilities within the screen, right? Because it took first 1 month to just get used to Zoom. Oh, I can share screen. Oh, I can do this. Oh, I can do that. And then we are starting to think about how to use this as a technology itself. But you're right. I mean, I can just have a class 15 minutes, or I can even have a voice note. If I just treat this as a I don't have to get so caught up with it. But if I just treat it as a medium, then I think there are many other ways in which I can ask, the students to actually go and explore things even in their own surroundings and environment. Um, and this question of counter was just interesting because I thought many a times in classroom, in physical classroom, and that's the nature of those classrooms, that it becomes a teacher and students, right? One can break that in this, and one can open up interesting and that has happened even where you see that collaborative sort of conversations lead up to interesting aspects about the topic we're discussing in the classroom that day. So yeah, I just found these two very, very powerful and very resonating. I never thought of this idea of peer learning. I knew about it, but I think it's important to think of it while very consciously as we make our, whatever we might want to call it as lesson plans or whatever for these classes, to enable that more and more and see what can happen from that. Yeah.
Just, Felipe, just one more thing, I'm going to put it and then leave it because you talked about I mean, we talked about we want to fight for the preservation somewhere of theater. We will come back to that eventually, and there's certain things we don't want to lose. We want to fight for the embodied feedback loop, and we don't want to forget these in the future when we come back to those spaces. But one of the things that I've been thinking about is, and Daniel's question also says that, and Daniel, if you want to elaborate further, please go ahead. But what are we teaching them for if half those physical spaces are going to be gone? Is it? I'm wondering about whether the drama school Mumbai is a school. You know, our logo is forge the next generation of theater makers. Theater makers.
Right.
And here I am thinking, what I found going back over the last couple of weeks is that I find myself telling everybody that, look, we train through theater because theater is that medium in which so much powerful learning happens, because that learning is happening at this embodied level. All the logic, the technology, everything that you spoke of, we learn in our bodies through the standing up and doing, as you said, right? We don't sit and think, we stand and think. We think in our bodies. And I keep coming back to this, but I've been saying that it's because theater gives us certain sets of superpowers. It's because theater gives us certain sets of capacities. Then we go out into the world and we become something else. We become a social change maker. We become a playwright. We become a filmmaker. We become a storyteller. But should I be dropping that word as a school? Should I be saying that we are, training the next generation of storytellers through the medium of theater? Or what is LASALLE? What am I supposed to be doing over the next, say, 2 to 5 years when the medium we know in the black box, in the proscenium, is denied us? Then what am I training them for?
That goes to the core of what Daniel was sharing in the chat. That's the reality check. The reality check of everything we're thinking is that theaters are closing, that there are no jobs, that's tough, and it's going to continue.
So what's my contract with the students coming into a drama school?
Yeah, so I'm still thinking through that. Two ways of thinking about it is, one, what is the economic history of theater? Two, what is the spatial history of theater? So how has theater been able to sustain itself historically? Thanks to what? What are the sponsors? What are the economies in which it subsists? Because this is not the first pandemic, and this is not the first disruption, and theater has remained. It has been suspended in the UK for a while, I think in the 16th century, but this is not the first time that this happens. So thinking historically might be a good way to begin thinking in future. One. Two, historically speaking, where are the theaters, right? So the big theater is always placed in the city square alongside the government palace, alongside the church in European countries. It's central to city planning, right? The space of entertainment, the space of spectacle is central to theater planning, which makes it now one of the most dangerous places for the virus, because it's where people congregate, masses of people. But where else can theater happen? What other areas in the city? How else can theater assemble communities that are not en masse, right? So again, these are lines of thoughts that are springing as I ask this question, but these are logic that are maybe useful to rethink. Now, in terms of higher education, the scenario that we're facing right now is that class of 2020 graduated into a world in disarray. This generation across, not only in theater, but across the world, the class of 2020 is going to face true hardship in the next year. The intake for 2021 is going to drop because different factors. For big universities that offer the campus experience, they can't bring the students to campus. China is going to be retreating the students, so the big Chinese market is going to retreat. Theater school, it's very likely that we're going to experience a drop in our recruitment, in our intake, because students will naturally want to be fair to be able to experience the full thing, unless we can guarantee a full thing, whatever that is. that means that the class of 23-24, which is by the time that we are hoping that the global economy can be more or less on track again, will graduate into an upheaval, an economical upheaval. And there's going to be jobs, class of 23-24, there's going to be a lot of theaters reopening, there's going to be a booming film industry, right? But then that means also that class of 24-25 will graduate in a bottleneck of jobs, because everybody is going to suddenly, right? So we need to be thinking not just now, we need to be thinking of the economy of the future, right? So thinking historically can also be teaching, right? So back in the 16th century, there weren't theater schools, right? We weren't graduating actors. Actors went to the company and learned the craft, right? What can we learn of those patterns to how we are applying now in terms of higher education? Because it's very important that we realize that we're speaking of theater in higher education, right?
That you yourself also said that like 20,000 universities are closing down, and maybe theater of higher education. I'm wondering why we're still pontificating. I mean, I know that you're at LaSalle and you have to think about it from that point of view also, but it doesn't seem to. It's almost like, why do we have to think about it from the frame of an institution? If pedagogy can be reimagined completely, then why do we think about it from the frame of an institution at all?
We could not. We could think outside the institution.
I want to go back to one more thing, because this came up. I had a pre-conversation about, so Chanakya and Amy are going to be having a conversation a few weeks from now, and I don't want to give it away, but I am going to bring it up because it was interesting enough. Because when you talked about the theater being that building right in the center town square, right next to the parliament and the church and the this and the this, you just sort of talked about theater as a center of wielding power by the established social authorities, and a structure that remains in place. And over here, we were talking about this idea of like all the individual spaces. Where else does theater exist is a very big question. Where's that act of community and the communion exist? And is there a way that, I mean, should we be teaching them theater? You didn't quite answer my question about, well, you did. So if I look at when you say economic upturn, and when you talk about how the market is going to come back and the industry comes back, it's almost somewhere my heart is in my mouth, because I'm like, oh my God, that means we're going to go back to things exactly the way they were before the pandemic. And that would be equally tragic. That's like Arundhati asking everyone, what are we going to take through the portal with us? And if somebody's saying everything. And I'm just, sorry, I don't have an answer or anything, but it's something I also noticed about this point.
I agree.
Because
I agree, right? Like, I mean, how do we react in the face of this data, no? Of this information and of this alarming situation? How do we, like, this is what is coming, right? So the question of what we bring to the portal is important. How do we pivot out in theater education and theater pedagogy? What can we teach? And this goes to your question, right? What is the new offering? What is the social contract that we want to revise of the theater school, and what are we offering? I think John wants to.
Yeah, my Wi-Fi connection's bad, so I hope you can hear me. It connects back to something you said earlier, Felipe. It seems, of course, there's a balance within institutions, but it does seem that you can sort of separate training artists into either training people to get jobs which serve the existing system, or helping people discover voices and aesthetics and political perspectives which will challenge the system, or change or transform or evolve the system, whatever. And one of them is potentially relatively a conservative job, and the other is potentially relatively a subversive and a radical job. I think one of the questions that, for me as an artist who is not part of an institution, but nonetheless has to work and has to enjoy within institutions at times, is what is going to be permitted to artists within those organizations that are fundamentally funding the arts to serve the existing system. British universities, the government is clear, they will fund students to study courses which lead to employment outcomes. The Arts Council pretty much clear that they're looking for work that is, although radical in thinking, not inherently subversive. So the other side of it is the work that says, how can we create institutions and organizations that say, we don't know how things are going to be. I've got no more idea than anyone else. I've been teaching theatre for 30 years. I've got no bloody idea what next year is going to create. It's fantastic. Therefore, we are in a place of immense democracy because the world has leveled us. And something that I found the things you were saying utterly fantastic, Felipe, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to listen. But one of the things that I've always sort of said in real space workshops, which people think is a false humility, but it's not a false humility, is that I'm the third most important teacher in the room, that the first most important teacher in the room is the student. She teaches herself. And the second most important teacher in the room is all the other students because they're going through the same experience. So peer-to-peer feedback allows them to compare experiences. And my job is to make the space and to put on the music. I mean, it's not quite right, but it sort of works like that.
Beautiful.
I wonder how much first of all, on my online teaching, I'm trying to see how that can work in Zoom space as well. That my job is as little as possible and empower the students to do as much as possible, but also how much I can use it to remind myself to be humble in the face of what we are encountering, that I do have skills and I do have the ability to facilitate spaces, but I don't have any sense of what is a good and a bad outcome now. I don't know what the good and bad outcomes are, and therefore I have to become as much a student as any of the students that I'm working with. Not quite, because I'm still there to guide, but in the bigger question, what voices am I permitting? What voices am I denying? What doors am I opening? What doors am I closing? It's the questions for me after 30 years of work have never been bigger, but also I think that the need for artists has never been greater. I
agree, and I really like what you're saying, John. My gist to the economic and the spatial history of theater is precisely in that spirit, right? If we realize that the one thing that is making theaters dangerous is that they are located in places of big gathering that are a place of social power, right? There's an outbreak in Japan right now because of a theater in a district of business, right? But and that also tells us that the way the pandemic is aligning with theater is in terms of structures of power. So where else can theater happen to challenge those structures of power, right? Theater has also a very rich history of intervening public space, of intervening other spaces for it to happen. So what is that history and what can we learn to precisely make theater safe, right? Because we should also don't forget that in the greatest canons of European philosophy that inform how contemporary political theory is made and informs the contemporary version of the nation state in Europe, in North America, and therefore most of the world, has a prejudice against theater as being nasty, dirty, right? This doesn't help. Suddenly the public assembly is dirty again, right? Because it is happening in these big theaters for 1,000 seaters, right? So it was a gist towards that. Like I really thank you for that, John. I think that we have the gist is exactly right. Like how do we disentangle theater from this alignment that we suddenly are into with big structures of power and big assemblies, right? How do we intervene this? Absolutely. And your second point on the teacher, like if I wouldn't say that if you are a vocational teacher, but if you have taught, this, right? That you enter into the room just being with the students, that's as much as you can do, right? The learning needs to happen in them. You know, I always like to think that my greatest skill as a teacher is making funny jokes so that they can relax and learn, right? That's, and at the end of my semester, I always make it evident to my students that I've been making fun of myself just so they can relax. And then we can read, you know, Plato. That's it, right? That's it. That's pretty much it. But yeah, absolutely. I think this is the point. Now, how does that impact the economic factor that Daniel is bringing up? That's also a big question, because actors need to eat, right? And small audiences don't necessarily feed. So in that sense, also thinking of the economical history of acting and of theater, you know, the birth of, and this goes back to your question, Johan, the birth of the drama school, of the theater department, is also entangled with the possibility of making a professional life out of being a theater maker, right? You get a degree, you are certified to practice theater now, right? But that's also something historically new. That's something that happened in the last 60 years of the 20th century. Before that, we didn't have that, right? And so actors would subsist, stable actors of companies, but they would also subsist of other things. So what are these other sectors of the economy that sustain theater, and where are they now, right? Not necessarily saying that we need to relinquish theater, or we have to be selling potatoes so that we can act at night.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily speaking of that, but what is the infrastructural change that is happening in the world at an economic level, and how can that inform the subsistence of theater in the way we want it to subsist? That's idealistic thinking at best, I have to admit. But
Well,
nevertheless, it's a provocation.
it is and it isn't, because one of the things I've been just thinking about is it's about how theater making and this whole sector that we come from adds value to society. And I think if you just start looking at adds value to society versus, can make money, the word, thinking of it as profession and monetary versus value add to society, I think we have a longer history that we can track back into and learn a lot from. And I think that that's one place. I also think that disentangling theater from power and taking it out of those centers and those nodes of social power, I also think that the solutions then come to these sort of planetary things. And I wanted to come back to your planetary, what did you call it?
Planetarity, you can call it.
Yeah, a planetarity idea. And that is just this, we're going to wrap in another 7 minutes, guys, because 1 hour 30 is what I've slotted for this. But one is I just found myself thinking about this particular play and thinking that we must revisit it, which is The Great Theater of the World. So I just wanted to put it out there. Calderon is one of my favorites. But the other is just, you and I were talking about what is opening up for the non-institutional drama school. I am so excited about the idea that I get to create an institution that can just say, I don't know, let's figure this out. And I'm really, really supremely excited about the idea of saying, fine, I want to be somebody that says that. How do we communicate that to the students who come in? I'm going to pay money for it. I don't know. And how are we'll figure that out. Problems to solve. It's another theater skill set. But the second one is, this idea about teaching globally or teaching across the planet and sharing across the planet, it also breaks up that north, south, east, west thing that you have a problem with. You had an idea of a course, right? Can we share about that? Are you comfortable talking about that? About other ways that doesn't have to be institution to institution. It could be studios to studios, or collectives to collectives, or people to people.
Well, there's several ways to approach this, right? The planetary question, obviously in the institutional framework, it has to do with formats of trans-institutional collaboration that require bureaucracy, require MOUs, require all of that. And that is feasible if you have the institutional infrastructure to do that. Non-institutional, there's also the whole avenue of not informal, but non-degree education that doesn't require an institution. It requires a bunch of experts training, right? and it requires some stage management that's in some part of the world, organizing registrations, etc. Now, that doesn't give you a degree, it gives you the skills, right? And this goes back to what John was saying, and Johan, you know, there could be a turn to a new understanding of global actor training that is not institution-based. It could be profitable to sustain, not profitable, but sustainable, but it doesn't, but then we need to rethink whether we want to continue giving degrees. Because the key thing here is that we're aligning theater education with higher education, with the industry of higher education, which is $1 billion, several billion dollars worth, right? And that is in clear recession. And that in that clear recession, theater is the first thing to go, for sure. So we could think of programs, of global programs of training that are not necessarily institution-based, but individual-based, different structures of monetary sustenance, and that also could be para-institutional in the sense that they can be parasites of the institution, right?
I was thinking of that.
Many of us enjoy the benefit of institutions with research funding, for example. So research funding could be, and careful, this is not to say that we should just abolish the institution. The institution has some value. But if you have access to funding, you could very well be organizing a school, a summer school, and justify it as research.
We'll be coming to you for
very
that.
Easy, right? It's very easy. And also something important is that in those networks of trans-institutional or para-institutional care, it is also vital that the colleagues that have, or the people that have access to institutional funding, provide funds to people that are not taken care of, right? So this is exactly a time in which we need to be taking care of seasonal, of part-time teachers, right? Of guest directors. You know, this is when a para-institutional thinking is also useful.
I'm actually seeing an opportunity where actually universities are going through the same crisis. They have to have a new relevance to justify fees, to justify recruitment. And if suddenly a course comes along that is a para, like the course created by us, and we say, we shop it around and we say, listen, you guys need a course like us because it's going to actually make you revenue. It's going to add to your offerings. It's not going to be an indulgence. It's going to be essential. I can find you the demand for it. And suddenly we're talking about a course that has, 500 students across 10 studios across the world, or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that anyone else wants to share? Amy, you came in late, but I'm letting the listeners be the listeners, unless they have something. But otherwise, Felipe, anything?
Thank you very much. Again, it's been really nice. Again, to emphasize that this is all thinking and brewing, right? I don't have any of the answers. In the thick of resolving everything as we all are, and resolving livelihoods and resolving curriculum and taking care of my students, and so this, I think that it's important just to acknowledge that we're all thinking at the same time, and that everything is provisional, but that in as much as it is provisional, we should also breathe into our thinking and let go of the emergency for a while, right? I think that for me, that's proved to be very important in the last few weeks, to breathe into the thinking, like, right, so stop. How do we react the next year? Because this is likely to go on for longer. How do we move?
Okay. Breathe into the thinking. Everyone, let's breathe into the thinking. This is exactly what I needed to hear today. Felipe, one of the things we've learned at the drama school is how to do applause online. This is how we do it. Thank you very much. And really, on behalf of all of us, thank you. I am going to be asking Felipe to come back in other avatars at the DSM and into our community. Please look out for Sita Mani next week. She's going to really be speaking about her work as a Feldenkrais practitioner, and much more about real journeys that she's been having with her Columbia students, because they're at the school over there, and it's as schizophrenic within the geographic region of New York, Juilliard, Columbia, and NYU. Between the three of them, even though they're living in the same physical reality of COVID, are having completely different responses to the whole thing. And that's going to be quite interesting to hear from her. It'll be much more practitioner based and much more movement teacher based. The week after that, we have Amy and Chanakya. I don't get to sit in this chair, and I leave them for it. And I really do hope you keep coming back. John is now becoming a regular attendee, except he goes away in August. And Felipe, do come back and bring more friends. And hopefully Unrehearsed Futures becomes a thing that is beyond all of us. Okay, great. And Shruti has shared some links. Felipe, your first part of the talk was about 25 minutes long, but it was really power-packed and beautiful. Do you mind if I make it available to everyone here?
Yeah, for sure.
And others who missed the talk?
Yeah.
Sure. Wonderful, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Everyone, good evening. Have a really good weekend.
Bye-bye.
Daniel. Shruti is